little bit about EverPower. We are based here in Pittsburgh. Our headquarters are right in the Strip, just about a stone's throw from here. We've got 750 megawatts across the country, although our focus is in the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast areas, but we have a sort of very broad and robust pipeline across the country. We operate projects from New York State to California. So just the basics on the process of developing a project. I kind of think of them in 4 stages. The whole process in 4 stages. The first is site selection. That's where's the wind, where is there capacity on transmission, are there compatible land uses, those kind of things, any fatal flaws. Just kind of go through that basic process. And then if it passes that, then we go on to the next stage, which is actually getting on the ground, doing surveys, doing studies. This is everything from birds and bats to shadow flicker, to noise, to socioeconomics, to cultural, historic resource surveys and those kind of things. That can take a long time. That can take 2, 3, 4 years, depending on where you are and what jurisdiction you're under. But once you get to that, you're into the construction, which is a relatively short period for wind. Once we're starting to dig dirt, we can, within a year or 2, build the entire project. And then we get to operations. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about operations, but all this is kind of trying to see. So you've seen some of the wholesale price volatility, I guess, on the bottom there, and then the output from the wind farm on the top. So from an operations standpoint, from a revenue standpoint, we need to figure out how to merge those two, and it can get very complicated, especially if we're on a merchant basis, meaning we're selling into the day-ahead markets. So we'll just talk a little bit, go to some of the current challenges that we're facing right now. We'll talk about some of the policy uncertainty, citing, and public issues, public acceptance. So from the policy standpoint, many of you have probably heard of the production tax credit. It's the main federal tax credit that is available for renewables. The main point of this picture is that over time, it's got the unique attribute that it keeps expiring or coming close to expiring. So every time it does that, you can see there's a very steep drop-off in generation or, new build the next year. And that just has to do with the development time cycles. We can't be investing the resources and time into these projects when we don't know what policy framework we'll be working in during construction. So that's why you get that. The other main policy mechanism at work in the wind industry is on the state level. It's called Renewable Portfolio Standards, which is basically a minimum amount of electricity that must be fulfilled by renewable generators. These are set by state regulators or state legislators. And the challenge there is that each one of those things is kind of a quilt work. So each one is generally the same, but different. Different in how it works, different in what qualifies, and then very different political dynamics as well. So you have some states where fighting to defend the RPS so that it doesn't get watered down or completely taken away. And other states where year to year, you're looking at things to enhance and grow it, and then everything in between. So it becomes a very challenging environment from a policy standpoint, especially if you're in multiple states. The other challenge is citing. I just put this up here. You probably heard there's rumors that wind kills birds and bats. It does, but how that impacts those populations and what we do to mitigate is a very long and uncertain and costly process. And that's just the point of that slide, and I won't get too much into that right now. And then there's the public issues, the public acceptance. So this one is from a study done by DBL investors, and the interesting thing here is they're comparing incentives across all of the energy sectors, or a range of energy sectors. And they looked at it in this graph in an interesting way, looking at it the first 30 years of a subsidy life. So, for the purposes of getting a new technology up and going. And the interesting thing there is the green line on the bottom is renewables. So you've got nuclear, you've got oil and gas, you've got others. And not to say, to me, we're a very energy-intensive society, economy. It's important to have new, innovative, and low-cost energy solutions. So we need to have these kind of programs, but to kind of paint it as renewables needs to stand on its own feet is a little bit disingenuous. Then we go more of the sort of local challenges when we're actually in the communities where we're building these projects. There are concerns about noise, about shadow flicker, and various other things. I just threw these two up here just to kind of show. And the point here is that we have tools. We have very good modeling tools that we can tell with pretty pretty good accuracy what kind of levels of impact are going to be present in the community. The challenge is what's acceptable and what's not, and especially because there are very individual reactions to some of these that for the vast majority of people, this kind of level is fine, or one level is fine, but there's always going to be a small percentage of people who are bothered by that impact, and that's where the challenge lies. And then finally on this, it's just sort of the point here is, any human endeavor has some impacts. Wind is no exception, so we always have to work hard to try to educate on what are the benefits of wind, from clean power to economic to jobs to all sorts of things. So we really have to kind of keep that in mind, and that's the challenge as we go through these development processes, is how do we do that, and be able to get the project online. So I'm going to just finish up here with a little bit of for the future. This is where maybe I'll get in a little bit of trouble, but so obviously we're looking at the demand for renewables. Where does the demand come from? Well, there's three main buckets I put that in. First is clean power plant, which I haven't mentioned here, but you've probably heard about that, which is just the US EPA's new regulations on carbon emissions for existing power plants. One of the ways for states to meet those targets is with renewable energy. So that potentially will create some demand, although that picture is a little fuzzy right now. RPS we've talked about, and then direct to customers. So you probably heard in the headlines, you see Amazon, Facebook, those kind of companies buying renewables, buying wind. That happens. It's a fairly small portion of demand right now, but it's increasingly important. So we have all that demand. Now how do we meet that demand? A lot of different ways. We hear a lot about the markets and the economics and how that works. One way that we look at is how do we get revenue certainty, at least from a dollars per megawatt hour through the lifetime of the project, and that's what you need to justify the large capital investments needed for these projects. And it's not just wind that needs that or is benefited by that. To kind of get a little bit more granular on that, and I just have a couple more slides here. So independent power producer, that's us. We then sell to either the wholesale suppliers, the utilities, or to retail suppliers. Neither of those guys can, in most markets, can offer longer term contracts. They can only go short distances, short times in the future. And that's either regulatory based, they don't have cost recovery for much more than 3 years, or they just don't have the market vision to go much beyond 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years on the retailer side. So that's leaving us right now with that direct customer, the Amazons, the Googles, those kind of guys, which is again a sort of developing, nascent type of market for that. And so what we're spending a lot of time on, and when I look in the future, is how can we get to the next step of renewable deployment in the United States? It's looking at those contracts. It's looking at the market mechanisms to do that, and we can do that in a competitive way, in a way that's not sort of the traditional regulated utility rate of return, but a competitive process where we're competing against like development, or any development. It can even be fuel neutral, and provide a value to ratepayers, which in the case of renewables is constant. We can tell you on day one of the contract and on year 20 of the contract what that cost of energy is going to be, and there's no volatility, there's no fuel cost component to that would change that. And that's one of the things we would do. And just to kind of give a sense of that, a visual sense of this, is very crude. There's a lot of detail here that I'm skipping, but this is the PJM day-ahead market, wholesale market, from 2001 until about 2014. This is all weight averaged. The red line on the middle is the weight average of all those days across that 15-year period or so. That's about $57 or so. So what this is saying is that on January 1 of 2001, if one of these customers was able to buy a long-term contract for something under $57 for 15 years, they would have come out ahead. And without giving up too many trade secrets here, we can offer that these days. So that's kind of the baseline theory. Obviously, a lot more detailed discussion about that, but that's where we are. And I won't get into the summary, so I'm out of time. But that's my presentation. Thanks.
I'm wondering if you could say a bit the considerations on transmission capacity when making these choices to develop wind power plants?
Yeah, real simply, we look, and there's existing bulk transmission, so we're an independent power producer, so we go into what's called the queue, the transmission queue, in most ISOs. And to do that, it's an open market system, so take PJM, for example. We can go into the queue, we can go to PJM and say, hey, I want to interconnect in here. They can't keep us out. And what they can do, though, is tell us, there's not enough capacity there, you need to do some upgrades, here's what the upgrades will cost, and it's our responsibility to pay those. So that, when I talk about the constraints there, if it's too much, if the system's already overloaded, the line's not big enough, and it looks like it would cost us too much to overload, to upgrade that system, then it's a deal killer for the project.
Question 5.
Dalia Patino, Duke University. What is the value of all the assets that are out there when the PPA expires? And how do you factor that into your investment decisions?
When a PPA expires?
Yeah,
okay, yeah. So the value after a PPA, you call that a residual value to the plant. Ideally, we enter into a 15 or 20-year contract at the beginning when we construct the plant. And at the end of it, you can kind of look at it like residual value. We can put in things, it's basically a guess. At that point, you're looking 15 years out, hopefully you're looking that far out, and you're taking some guess as to what the market's going to be, and then what the electric market is, and what the attributes, the RECs. I didn't get into, but that renewable energy credit that you can buy and sell under these under the RPS system. So it's basically a guess, but you're financing that in. You're saying, are we going to cover the capital costs with the PPA, right? And then it's a residual value, right?
You have time for one more? Okay. Next.
Hi, Latika Lagalu, Assistant Professor of Economics at Michigan Tech. I was wondering if you have any idea about how much steel actually goes into production of a typical wind turbine at EverPower. And second part of the question is there any trend in the industry towards use of other materials other than steel that are less polluting? Because from what I understand, steel production itself produces a lot of pollution. So is there any trend towards using something other than steel, although I don't know how technically feasible that would be? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I can answer that in a couple ways. The first one is, I don't know how much steel is in there off the top of my head. I can get that for you pretty quickly if you need to. You can see me afterwards. But yeah, they're all constantly looking at new materials, and that the steel and the towers that hold the wind farm. We're looking at different structures. It might still be steel, but maybe a lattice structure, something that uses less but is just as strong. And just to the point of the amount of energy it takes to actually make the steel and transport that on site, the sort of cradle to grave assessments of energy use and carbon use gives us it takes about 3 years of a wind farm's operation until it's created as much energy as it took to make all of the parts and transfer those parts to site. So it's very efficient in that way.
So since we're running behind because of the previous session by about 30 minutes, we were supposed to end by now. So we have a couple options. We could just end right now, and then you guys can talk to the panelists if they're willing to stick around for a couple questions. What do you guys think of that idea? Does that work for you? Okay, so then thank you all very much. Let's thank our panelists for coming. This has been excellent.